everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to new Discourses Bullets, where I give a short bullet point-like summary of a single topic from woke Marxism that we need to understand so that we can defeat this. My current big mission, of course, is to convince people of an important fact about woke, which is that woke is a cult. And there's probably no better way to do this. I mean, I have copious podcasts and talks and essays out talking about whether it's Gnosticism or Hermeticism or Theosophy and its connections to woke. There's probably no better way to do this than to just read to you from the Brazilian Marxist educator Paulo Freire in his book, The Politics of Education, a passage about a page long in this book that came out in 1984. I just want to remind you quickly of who Paulo Freire is and what he created. Paulo Freire is the father of, he was a Marxist, and he is the father of the educational method that our schools use to brainwash kids today. It's called critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy doesn't aim to teach children academic material. It teaches to use academic material to radicalize students into what they call critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is what you awaken to. It's the consciousness you awaken to in woke. Woke actually took all these things like critical race theory and queer theory and feminism and even the climate change stuff and mixed it all together in schools of education primarily to create something called critical constructivist epistemology. There's no quiz at the end. You don't need to remember that yet. We'll come back in another podcast. And that's the heart and soul of where woke came from. And it's based off of the methods of critical pedagogy, which were developed by Paulo Freire, who is a Brazilian Marxist educator who has ruined education and turned it into what it is today. In critical pedagogy, just to very briefly summarize, and again, I insist, it is a cult brainwashing technique posing as education. Here's how it works. In critical pedagogy, the idea is not that you use academic material to teach academic subjects. The goal is that you use academic material as a justification to have radicalizing political conversations with the students. So the math lesson becomes an excuse to bring up topics you'll discuss through a lens of critical race theory or queer theory or socialism or climate change, environmentalism, global citizenship, education for sustainable development, and so on and so forth, using tools like culturally relevant teaching or critical race theory or education for sustainable development. It's actually a tool, not just something that they teach, or social and emotional learning. All of them are derived, at least in part, if not in whole, from Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy methods. And what I want to impress upon you is it's not just that critical pedagogy is brainwashing, it's brainwashing into a cult. And that fact that it's a cult is extraordinarily visible in this passage about a page and a half long, which I've read before in a podcast at full length, reading through this entire chapter of The Politics of Education. Now, I'm going to kind of start in the middle of a paragraph and read down, like I said, about a page. For those of you who have a copy of the book, it's on pages 122 and 123, and it's in the middle of chapter 10, which is a chapter about religious education and religion in particular, the church and its role in the middle of this book about education for whatever reason. And the reason is, by the way, that Marxists see religion and education as the same thing. And the education that they're doing to awaken people into the woke cult, critical consciousness, is in fact religious education. It's Sunday school just all week long. And I think you're going to understand that that's what critical pedagogy is by the time we finish this passage. So I'll start kind of in the middle of a paragraph, so you'll have to catch up kind of in the context as we go, but it starts here. In committing themselves, and it's talking about both religious educators and educators at large, in committing themselves to the oppressed, they begin a new period of apprenticeship. This is not, however, to say that their commitment to the oppressed is therefore finally sealed. It will be severely tested during the course of this new apprenticeship when confronted, in a more serious and profound way than ever before, with the hazardous nature of existence. To pass such a test is not easy. So what he's saying is that when you take up the critical path as an educator, religious or not, you're going to be challenged as to whether or not you're truly committed and to the new view, which is the side of the oppressed. And it's going to be a tremendous challenge. And, he talks throughout the chapter in the book about what those challenges will look like. People will tell you that you're wrong, that you're bad, that you're doing the wrong thing. And in fact, frankly, the hazardous nature of existence, reality itself will tell you you're wrong because you're a Marxist and you're in a cult. But this is what he actually says about how you will go to maintain this new apprenticeship, this, which you remember is an apprenticeship in solidarity with the oppressed. It is taking the side of the oppressed and learning from them, learning from their claims of oppression. In other words, if the critical race theorist comes out and says, this is what it means to experience racism, you're going to learn from that. And that's your apprenticeship as an educator, is to continue to indoctrinate yourself further in. And here's, again, just one more time so I can say the word. This is a cult. This is religious in nature. Listen to how he describes it. He says, this new apprenticeship will violently break down the elitist conception of existence they had absorbed while being ideologized. In other words, ideologies are what society presents you with that keeps you from being a Marxist in Marxism. So they are going to de-ideologize you by making you a Marxist because they claim that that means seeing reality correctly. So the idea is that you've absorbed all these elitist conceptions, and it's going to violently break that down as you go through this new apprenticeship on the side of the oppressed. He says, the sine qua non the apprenticeship demands is that, first of all, they really experience their own Easter. Let that one sink in a second. That they really experience their own Easter, that they die as elitists so as to be resurrected on the side of the oppressed, that they be born again with the beings who are not allowed to be. Now, at this point, we're done, right? I don't have to continue reading the rest of the page to convince you that this is cult. This is cult stuff. You're going to you have to die and be reborn on the side of the oppressed. You have to die and be resurrected as a new remade being on the side of the oppressed. That's what they say, that you have to be born again with the beings, he says, who are not allowed to be. In other words, with the oppressed. Such a process, he says, implies a renunciation of myths that are dear to them, the myth of their superiority, of the purity of soul, of their virtues, their wisdom, the myth that they save the poor, the myth of the neutrality of the church, of theology, education, science, technology, the myth of their own impartiality. So in the process of going through this personal Easter, you have to die, he says, to the idea that you have purity to your soul, that you're virtuous, that you have wisdom. You have to completely humiliate yourself before the oppressed, who are elevated like prophets of a new religion that you are now committed to. He says, from these grow the other myths of the inferiority of other people, of their spiritual and physical impurity, and of the absolute ignorance of the oppressed. That's all what you're going to have to die to. So he goes on, he says, this Easter, he's going to he's going to explain what it means to die and be resurrected in the religion of woke. He says, this Easter, which results in the changing of consciousness. In other words, it results in woke, waking up to a new consciousness. He says this Easter, which results in the changing of consciousness, must be existentially experienced. The real Easter is not commemorative rhetoric. It is praxis. It is historical involvement. Now, if you forgot, praxis is a Marxist word for activism. It means putting Marxist theory into practice in the world. He says the old Easter of rhetoric, that's the one that Christians believe in, by the way. The old Easter of rhetoric is dead with no hope of resurrection. That's a choice of poetic license for Paulo Freire there, isn't it? The old Easter of rhetoric is dead with no hope of resurrection. It is only in the authenticity of historical praxis. Pause, we'll come back and read it again. Historical means doing Marxist activism. They believe that they are assuming the activity of moving history to its intended endpoint. So when you see the word historical in a weird place in a Marxist writing, they're talking about doing Marxism. Praxis is activism. So when they say historical praxis, that means doing activism to move history to its intended endpoint, which means doing Marxism. It is only in the authenticity of historical praxis, which is doing Marxism, that Easter becomes the death that makes life possible. But the bourgeois worldview, basically necrophiliac, that means death-loving, and therefore static, is unable to accept the supremely biophiliac, which means life-loving, experience of Easter. So what he's saying is that the Christian conception of Easter is death-loving. It is a death worship. Whereas the Marxist understanding of being reborn on the side of the oppressed is life-loving. Of course, this is a direct inversion. Marxism is a death cult, but I hope this is going to become very clear. Marxism is also an inversion of Christianity. I think that also makes that very clear. He then goes on and says, the bourgeois mentality, which is far more than just a convenient abstraction, kills the profound historical dynamism of Easter and turns it into no more than a date on the calendar. So that's what Christians are celebrating on Easter, a date on the calendar. And they're just using commemorative rhetoric, commemorative of, whatever it is that Easter's about in the Christian religion. It's not real. It's not alive because you aren't dying and being reborn. You aren't dying and being reborn on the side of the oppressed. This, by the way, remember, is for what an educator is supposed to go through. This is pure liberation theology. Liberation theology is Marxism that has infiltrated the Catholic hierarchy and Catholic doctrine and framed itself like Catholic faith. Okay, so it was a deliberate Soviet plot to create liberation theology inside the Catholic Church and using Catholic doctrine. And that's actually what you just heard. Woke means awakening to a cult understanding of yourself or just a cult identity based on liberation theology, which is Marxism reformulated in religious language. He goes on, though. He says, the lust to possess, a sign of the necrophiliac worldview, rejects the deeper meaning of resurrection. Why should I be interested in rebirth if I hold in my hands as objects to be possessed the torn body and soul of the oppressed? Isn't that evocative of the gospel, but in the most terribly perverse and awful way? He says, I can only experience rebirth at the side of the oppressed by being born again with them in the process of liberation. Now remember what liberation means. Liberation means liberation from the existing society. It means liberation from responsibility. It means liberation from work. It means liberation from everything that's not Marxism. In Marxism, communism is the promised land. It's the objective. It's the fantasy goal that we achieve when we all become perfect Marxists, perfect socialists. And that's what you're being born again to enact through your activity of historical praxis. But Frady says, I cannot turn such a rebirth into a means of owning the world, since it is essentially a means of transforming the world. So, of course, you're going to be reborn on the side of the oppressed. You're going to go through this personally yourself. You're going to die to who you were as a bourgeois or as a privileged person, and you're going to be reborn understanding as an ally and an activist, or maybe even recognizing your own oppression where you had been suppressing it before, and then you're going to engage in your historical praxis in order to transform the world. In other words, to take the world not as it is, but to change it into something different, to destroy what is and replace it with something new. That's at the heart, and that's why you always see this word transform or transformative or transformation everywhere in Marxist literature. You should have a huge red flag every time you get some document, say from your kid's school or from your workplace, that says that they're going to transform something. By the way, that's also a religious word. It's an explicitly religious word. And he says, just to finish the section, if those who were once naive continue their new apprenticeship, they will come to understand that consciousness is not changed by lessons, lectures, and eloquent sermons, but by the action of human beings on the world. Consciousness does not arbitrarily create reality, as they thought in their old naive days of subjectivist idealism. In other words, if you want to take this awakened consciousness and transform the world, what he's saying is you have to become an activist. You have to do the historical praxis. And the entire point of critical pedagogy is to awaken the desire and the position for students to become activists using academic material as the catalyst that turns them into an activist. So they don't necessarily learn to read or do math or whatever, because the reading and math lessons are used as excuses to do radicalizing political work with the students. He's got the whole book is about the methods of how that's to be done, so that they'll be activated to go do Marxist activism against their society. He says, in fact, that the whole process of critical consciousness is denouncing that which exists, so you can announce the possibility of something new, and less oppressive. And so this is a cult. It is a destructive cult. Its goal is to destroy the society, but it's very, very clear, since it's written in the language of not just death and rebirth, of a renewal of who you are, new values, new identity, but a literal death and resurrection of who you are as a socially constructed person, because that's their worldview, is that you're constructed by social forces that have made you who you are. So you're going to die to that and reconstruct yourself as an activist against those social forces. This is a cult. That's what this is. Marxism is a cult. Woke is a form of Marxism. Woke is a cult, and it believes that its job is to effect death and rebirth on the side of the oppressed. That's what it means to be an ally. That's what you see embodied in the act of transition, which is downstream from queer theory and what we call gender ideology, which is more formally or correctly a critical constructivist ideology of gender and sexuality. That's what you see throughout all of woke, and that's what woke means. So I want you to really get this into you, really understand this, and understand it on a deep level. And if you're a Christian, I think it should be extremely uncomfortable for you right now in being able to see this. Woke is a cult. We need to start being able to identify it as a cult, communicate to people that it's a cult, hopefully start to deprogram people who are on the outer rim of that cult. And it sounds like that's a small group. 80% at least of the people who are in the cult don't know they're in the cult, and they're not deeply committed. They're socially committed. They're emotionally committed. They are not intellectually committed. They don't understand what they're in. They are the primary victims of this cult. And we need to start working to deprogram them, both for their sake and for our sake, the greater sake of society, because they will, if there are enough of them and they're activated enough, they will destroy what we have. I want you to imagine the idea of Jonestown taking over the federal government, because that's exactly what woke is. I'm not exaggerating. That is exactly what woke is. And you just heard the proof. This is a cult. Woke is a cult. We need to treat it as a cult. We need to get other people to see it as a cult. And we need to put a stop to it like what it is, which is a cult.